If your house began watching you, would you even notice? That was the question Emma Wilson whispered to her husband Daniel on the first night they moved into the old colonial farmhouse on Ravenwood Hill. She meant it as a joke. But years later, neighbors would remember her words as a chilling prophecy. The Wilsons weren't ghost hunters or thrill seekers. They were a perfectly normal family. Daniel, a high school history teacher with a love for dusty books. Emma, a nurse who worked long shifts at St. Mary's Hospital. And their two kids, Maya, 13, already too smart for her age, and Josh, 9, the kind of boy who built forts out of anything. They had been searching for a fresh start outside the city, a place quieter, cleaner, cheaper. When they found the farmhouse, it seemed perfect. Huge yard, thick woods out back, a wide porch that looked like it had been stolen from a postcard. And the price? Almost too good to be true, but bargains often hide secrets. The realtor, a pale man with a smile too wide, rushed them through the tour. Original 1800s structure, strong bones, and you'll notice the character. Folks around here don't appreciate history like you might. Character was one word for it. The house had a heavy presence, as though the air itself pressed down on you. The walls seemed thicker than necessary, swallowing sound. And the windows, the windows, were all uneven, mismatched, as if whoever built them couldn't decide what the house was supposed to look at. Still, Daniel loved the idea of restoring it, and Emma loved the yard. The kids loved the attic, which was big enough to feel like a secret castle, so they bought it. The first week was ordinary. Unpacking, late-night pizza, laughter echoing through empty halls. Emma thought the creaks and groans were just the house settling after years of vacancy. She told herself the strange drafts were from cracks in the old wood. But by the second week, things started to feel different. It was Maya who noticed first. "Mom," she said one morning over cereal, "do you ever feel like the house is watching us?" Emma frowned. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Maya shrugged, spooning milk. "Like, when I walk down the hall, I feel like someone's looking out at me. Not from behind, from inside the walls." Daniel chuckled and ruffled her hair. "That's called imagination. Perfectly healthy for a budding writer." But Emma couldn't shake the way Maya's voice had cracked when she said it. One night, Emma returned home late after her hospital shift. The house was dark, except for a faint glow spilling from the living room. She thought Daniel had fallen asleep with the TV on. But when she stepped inside, the glow wasn't coming from the television. It was coming from the walls themselves. Tiny cracks between the old planks shimmered faintly, like veins of moonlight. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw movement inside. Shadows sliding behind the wood, too fluid to belong in solid walls. And then it was gone. Emma stood frozen, keys still in hand. She almost woke Daniel but stopped herself. It was late. She was exhausted. Hospitals did that to your brain, made you see things when you were too tired to trust your eyes. Still, she slept with the bedroom light on. The next morning, Josh came running to her, eyes wide. "Mom, there's someone in the attic." Emma knelt down, heart leaping. "What do you mean?" "I heard footsteps last night. Not creaky wood stuff, like walking. Slow, careful. I think they were looking for me." Daniel dismissed it again. "It's squirrels, buddy. Old houses get critters." But when Daniel climbed up to check, there were no droppings, no nests, no signs of squirrels or raccoons. Just dust, stale air, and thick shadows that seemed to swallow the flashlight beam. He came back down pale and quieter than before. That weekend, Emma tried to push the unease away. She poured herself into gardening while Daniel began sanding the porch rail. The kids played in the yard. The house loomed behind them, silent, patient. When Emma went inside for lemonade, she heard it. A whisper. She froze in the kitchen, ears straining. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like the sound of someone breathing through clenched teeth, low and wet, coming from behind the pantry wall. She dropped the pitcher. Glass shattered, lemonade soaking her shoes. "Emma?" Daniel called from outside. She forced her voice steady. "It's nothing. Just dropped it." But she didn't open the pantry again that day. That night, the children slept fitfully. Maya tossed in her bed, muttering about eyes in the ceiling. Josh woke crying, insisting he'd seen a hand slide across his window glass, except his room was on the second floor. Daniel tried to laugh it off, but even he seemed frayed. When he kissed Emma goodnight, she noticed his hands were trembling. And then, just past 3 a.m., the entire family woke at once. A sound tore through the house, deep, resonant, like a groan of wood mixed with a voice. It wasn't just heard, it was felt, vibrating in their bones. The walls shuddered, the pictures rattled. The sound swelled until it seemed the house itself was exhaling after holding its breath for decades. And over it all came one clear word, whispered through the cracks. Leave. The Wilsons sat frozen in their beds, listening, praying it would stop. When silence returned, it was heavier than before, pressing down on them like the house was waiting for their answer. Emma clutched Daniel's arm, whispering, "We can't stay here." But from the darkness came the soft creak of a floorboard inside their bedroom. The night after she found the old photograph, Emma couldn't sleep. Her dorm room felt colder than usual, as if the heating had failed only in her corner of the building. She wrapped herself tighter in her blanket, her eyes glued to the faint rectangle of moonlight that filtered through the blinds. Every creak of the pipes, every groan of the ancient wood beneath her bed made her feel watched. She tried convincing herself it was only nerves, but her instincts whispered otherwise. Something was deeply wrong in this place. By 2:30 a.m., exhaustion weighed heavily on her eyelids. She was about to drift into sleep when the sound of soft scratching pulled her back. At first, she thought it was a mouse inside the wall, but the sound was too deliberate, too slow. It wasn't the frantic scampering of a rodent. It was as though someone or something was dragging a fingernail down the plaster just behind her headboard. Emma froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She dared not move. The scratching grew louder, tracing from the bottom of the wall upward, inch by inch, until it stopped directly behind where her head rested on the pillow. Then silence. Terrible, suffocating silence. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she slowly reached for her phone on the nightstand. With trembling fingers, she turned on the flashlight and pointed it toward the wall. Nothing. The paint was smooth, untouched. She exhaled shakily, almost laughing at herself for being so paranoid. But just as she lowered the phone, the flashlight caught something, a shadow on the far wall near her desk. Her heart seized. The shadow was shaped like a figure, tall and thin, with shoulders hunched unnaturally forward. But the worst part, it wasn't cast by anything in the room. Emma's eyes darted around. Her desk lamp, her chair, the pile of textbooks. None of it matched the silhouette stretching across the wall. The shadow didn't move. It stood there, utterly still, watching her. Emma couldn't scream. Her throat locked up in fear. She blinked, and for the briefest second she thought she saw the shadow's head tilt, as though acknowledging her presence. She fumbled for her bedside lamp, desperate to fill the room with light. When the bulb flicked on, the shadow was gone. Shaking, she left the lamp on all night and didn't sleep a second. By dawn, she looked pale and hollow-eyed, her mind replaying the image of that impossible figure. The next morning, she forced herself into her usual routine, hoping daylight would banish the fear. She headed to her first class, but she couldn't focus. Every shadow in the lecture hall seemed to flicker unnaturally at the corners of her vision. When she opened her notebook, she found something that made her blood run cold. On the first blank page, faintly etched into the paper as if written with a dry pen, were 3 words. "You found us." Emma slammed the notebook shut, her hands trembling. She wanted to tell someone, anyone. But what could she say? That shadows were writing messages in her notebook? That she saw figures in the night? She'd sound insane. By evening, she decided she needed answers. She returned to the library and searched for records of her dormitory's history. The building was over 100 years old, originally constructed as a boarding house. Buried in the archives, Emma discovered newspaper clippings about a string of disappearances from the 1930s. Young women who lived in the house had vanished without a trace. The reports grew eerily repetitive. Each girl had last been seen retreating to her room late at night. None were ever found. Her stomach tightened as she pieced it together. The photograph she'd found in her closet. Could one of those women have lived in her room? Could the shadows she saw belong to them? As darkness fell again, Emma's anxiety grew unbearable. She dreaded the moment she would have to return to her room, but something compelled her, an invisible pull she couldn't resist. That night, she left the lights on again and tried to distract herself by scrolling through her phone. Around midnight, the temperature dropped suddenly, so sharp and biting that her breath fogged in the air. Then, the scratching returned. Louder this time. Instead of behind her headboard, it came from inside her closet, the very place where she had discovered the old photograph. Her chest tightened as she forced herself to stand. Each step toward the closet door felt like wading through water, her legs heavy with dread. She reached out, her hand trembling as it gripped the knob. She pulled it open. The closet was empty, but the shadows inside seemed darker, thicker, like liquid blackness pooling at the edges. For a split second, she thought she saw fingers curling out from the dark, retreating just as the closet light flickered on. Emma slammed the door shut and stumbled back, her breath ragged. She knew she wasn't imagining this. Something lived in those shadows, something that had been waiting for her to find it. And then she remembered the words etched into her notebook. "You found us." It wasn't a warning, it was a greeting. Suddenly, from the corner of her room, she heard the creak of the chair at her desk, the sound of weight settling into it. Emma turned slowly, dread flooding every nerve in her body. The chair was facing her bed now, and though nothing visible sat in it, the faint outline of a shadowed figure lingered in the air, as if patiently waiting for her to acknowledge its presence. Emma's lips parted to scream, but the lights flickered violently and went out. Emma is now trapped in total darkness with whatever presence has claimed her room. The house groaned like an old man in his sleep. That's how Daniel described it to himself as he lay awake in the upstairs bedroom, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling above him. Every few minutes, the wood seemed to shift and sigh, a hollow echo traveling through the halls as though the structure itself resented his presence. The air smelled faintly of mildew, like wet earth and something older, something that had been sealed away for too long. He told himself it was just age, just the product of years of neglect. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't only old, it was alive. The first night was always the hardest in a new place, especially in a house as unfamiliar as this. Daniel rolled over, trying to force himself into sleep, but the silence wouldn't let him. It wasn't true silence, not really. Beneath the distant hum of cicadas outside, he kept hearing little things. A scratch against the wall, a faint shuffle down the hallway, the unmistakable creak of a step on the staircase, too heavy to be the house simply settling. Each sound snapped him wide awake, his body stiffening under the thin blanket. At one point, his breath caught in his throat when he thought he heard whispering. Not loud enough to make out words, but soft, like two voices murmuring just outside his door. He sat up, heart racing, listening so intently that his ears rang. The whispers stopped instantly, like they had realized he was listening. He wanted to laugh it off. Maybe it was the wind, funneled through the cracks in the siding. Maybe his tired brain was playing tricks. But as he reached for the glass of water on the nightstand, his hand froze in midair. The doorknob across the room rattled. Slow, deliberate. Metal scraping against metal as though someone outside was trying to turn it, but without success. Daniel's breath grew shallow. He wanted to shout, to demand who was there, but his voice betrayed him. Instead, he stared at the knob, waiting for it to move again. For a long, agonizing moment, it didn't. The house returned to its stillness. but he couldn't shake the impression that something on the other side was watching, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him. He drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by disjointed dreams. A staircase that seemed to descend forever. A woman in white, her face hidden by shadows, standing at the end of a long corridor. A door opening slowly on its own, revealing only blackness beyond. He woke with a start sometime around 3 a.m. A cold sweat clung to his skin. The whispering was back, closer this time. He could swear it was coming from inside his room. But when he snapped on the lamp, the room was empty. The sunlight did little to calm him. It should have been comforting, flooding through the warped blinds and painting the dust motes gold. But instead it made everything feel worse, as if the brightness only highlighted how wrong this place was. Daniel forced himself downstairs, every creak of the floorboards reminding him of the night before. In the kitchen, he found an old newspaper spread across the counter. He didn't remember leaving it there. The pages were yellow, brittle, and dated over a decade ago. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Headlines about local politics, a fair coming to town, ads for old stores that probably didn't exist anymore. But then he saw it. An article tucked into the corner of the front page. Local woman missing, last seen near Riverbend House. Riverbend House, his new home. The photo was grainy, but her face was clear enough. A young woman with dark eyes and a serious expression, staring straight at the camera. Something about her unsettled him. Not her features, but the familiarity. It was as if he had seen her before, though he couldn't place where. Daniel's hands trembled as he turned the paper over. The next page carried follow-up stories, search parties, family statements, and a final headline that sent chills crawling up his spine. Case closed. Body never found. The woman had vanished, and apparently, she had vanished here. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to set the paper aside. His rational brain tried to stitch together explanations. Maybe the paper was just left behind by the previous owners. Maybe the stories had nothing to do with the noises he heard last night. But deep down, his gut screamed otherwise. And then, he froze. The faintest whisper drifted through the room. Not from the hall this time. Not from upstairs. It came from directly behind him. Have you ever walked into a place and felt, without a shadow of doubt, that something was watching you, even though your eyes insisted the room was empty? That's exactly what Emily felt every time she crossed the threshold of the apartment. The place had become a breathing entity, aware of her presence, responding to her movements with a sinister patience, like a predator waiting for its prey to tire before the final strike. The nights were the worst. They no longer passed in quiet darkness, but dragged on, every minute bloated with invisible eyes pressing down on her. The scratching sounds behind the walls grew louder, and sometimes they came from impossible places. The ceiling, the floorboards, even the inside of her closet. She would lie awake, clutching the blanket to her chest, her ears straining, her heart slamming against her ribs like a desperate fist against a locked door. One night, Emily dared herself to confront the sound. She armed herself with a flashlight and sat on the edge of her bed, waiting. The scratching came faint at first, like nails raking gently across wood. She shined the light toward the wall. The noise stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed into her skull, demanding she listen closer. Slowly, the sound returned, only this time, it wasn't scratching. It was tapping. A rhythm. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. She stared at the wall in horror, her mind screaming that this wasn't random noise. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate. Emily couldn't bear it. She bolted from the room, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood as she fled into the living room. Her phone lay on the couch, and she grabbed it with trembling fingers. For a moment, she hovered over the screen, torn between calling Marcus, the police, or her parents. But something inside her whispered, "Don't. Don't tell anyone. They'll never believe you." Instead, she opened her notes app and typed out the pattern she had heard. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. She repeated it to herself over and over until it became a part of her. She didn't know why, but she felt that remembering it was important. Almost like it was a clue. The next morning, the apartment looked deceptively normal. Sunlight spilled through the blinds, dust motes drifted lazily in the beams of light, and the air smelled faintly of coffee. Marcus made breakfast, humming a tune that grated against Emily's raw nerves. He was cheerful, as though the oppressive dread didn't cling to the walls like mildew. She stared at him, her fork hovering over her plate, wondering how he could act so calm. "Rough night?" he asked, noticing her pale face. Emily swallowed hard. "Marcus, have you ever heard anything at night? In the walls?" Marcus's smile faltered just slightly. He looked at her, then down at his food. "Old buildings make noise, you know that. Pipes, wood shifting, rats." "These aren't rats," Emily snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "It's someone. I heard a pattern, tapping, like it was talking to me." The room went heavy with silence. Marcus set his fork down, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and said, "If it's bothering you that much, maybe you should stay at your parents' place for a while." Emily blinked at him. "You want me to leave?" No, Marcus said quickly, forcing a laugh. "I just mean it might help. You've been under a lot of stress lately." But she saw it then, the flicker in his eyes, the way his hands tightened around his coffee cup. He knew something. He wasn't just brushing it off. He was hiding. That night, Emily decided to test him. She pretended to go to bed early, lying stiffly under the covers until she heard Marcus settle on the couch in the living room. The apartment went still. The minutes stretched long, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. Then, soft, deliberate footsteps padded down the hall. Emily's pulse spiked. She peeked through a crack in her bedroom door. Marcus wasn't in the living room anymore. He was standing in the hallway, his head tilted toward the wall, listening. Slowly, he lifted his hand and tapped against the plaster. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Emily's blood turned to ice. That was the same pattern she'd heard, the same one she had memorized. Marcus wasn't just aware of the noises, he was answering them. She stumbled backward, her breath hitching. The floor betrayed her with a squeak, and Marcus's head snapped toward her door. His eyes met hers through the narrow crack, and in that moment, his face was empty, stripped of its usual warmth, cold, watchful, almost other. Emily slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing her back against the wood as her chest heaved. She didn't sleep at all that night, listening to the faint sound of tapping echoing throughout the apartment. She was trapped with something, or someone, she no longer recognized. By morning, Marcus was back to his easy, cheerful self, frying eggs and asking if she wanted orange juice. But Emily couldn't shake the image of his face in the dark hallway, the mechanical way he had tapped on the wall. She didn't know who Marcus was anymore, or worse, what he had become. The apartment was no longer a place of safety. It was a labyrinth, each corner holding secrets she wasn't meant to uncover. But she couldn't ignore it anymore. She had to dig deeper to understand what was really happening here, and she had to do it soon, before the apartment claimed her too. Because one truth was clawing at her mind, refusing to be buried. Marcus wasn't living with her anymore. He was living with it. The night had grown thick with silence, yet Emily could not rest. The storm outside had calmed, but the air within the abandoned town seemed heavier, as if the storm had simply moved indoors, into the very walls of the house where she had taken shelter. The single candle flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the broken furniture, the rotting wallpaper peeling like skin, and the shattered photographs on the floor. Every now and then, Emily swore the shadows stretched unnaturally, bending and curling toward her when the flame dipped low. Sleep was impossible. Her body longed for rest, but her mind was wound too tightly, pulled by something invisible that whispered from the cracks of the house itself. She pressed her back against the cold wall, knees tucked to her chest, listening for any sound beyond her own shallow breathing. At first, there was nothing. But then it came. A faint murmur, a low vibration, like someone speaking through the layers of wood and plaster. She froze, heart hammering. The voice was muffled, impossible to understand, but it was there. Not the howling wind, not the creak of old beams. This was speech. She strained her ears, trying to catch a word, a syllable, and then, very faintly, it became clear. "Don't. Stay." The candle flickered violently, as if reacting to the voice, and Emily scrambled to her feet, pressing her hand against the peeling wallpaper where the sound had come from. Her pulse raced. Was she hallucinating from exhaustion, or had the house truly spoken? She placed her ear against the wall, trembling, and waited. For several seconds there was only silence. Then, suddenly, a chorus of voices erupted, not one but many. Layered voices of men, women, and children, all whispering at once, each overlapping the other, filling her head with incomprehensible words. She stumbled back, clutching her ears, her knees weak. The candle toppled from its holder, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers grew louder, spreading from the walls to the floorboards, from the ceiling to the broken windows, surrounding her completely. They didn't come from any single direction. They were everywhere. Emily bolted for the candle, hands fumbling in the dark, finally relighting it with the trembling matches she had salvaged earlier. The moment the flame sparked to life, the whispers ceased. The silence returned as if nothing had happened, but her heart refused to calm, and her skin prickled with cold sweat. She forced herself to breathe, trying to steady her thoughts. "It's just the house creaking. Just my imagination," she whispered aloud, though even as she said the words, she knew she didn't believe them. Determined not to sit still, she decided to explore the rest of the house. The oppressive silence was worse than movement. She picked up the candle, its light throwing nervous shapes across the staircase ahead. Each step groaned under her weight as she climbed, the shadows shifting unnaturally as if something unseen followed just a few inches behind her. At the top of the stairs, she found a long hallway lined with doors. Most were cracked open, showing glimpses of decayed rooms filled with dust, broken toys, and moldy furniture. But one door at the very end was shut tight. Emily felt a tug deep in her gut, a strange pull as though that door was waiting for her. The candle flame quivered as she approached, her fingers trembling against the doorknob. She turned it slowly. The door opened with a groan that sounded almost human. Inside was a small room, no larger than a closet, with bare wooden walls. And carved into those walls were hundreds of names. Some were scratched deeply, as though clawed in desperation, while others were faint and fading with time. She leaned closer, eyes darting across the chaotic scrawl of letters. Dozens of names overlapped each other, but one name repeated more than the rest. Her own. Emily. The air in the room grew impossibly cold, her breath visible as white mist. The candle sputtered and nearly went out. She stumbled back, slamming the door shut, her pulse thundering in her ears. How could her name be there? She had never been here before, never even heard of this town until that night. Yet someone, no, many someones, had carved it over and over, like a warning or a prophecy. Shaking uncontrollably, Emily pressed her back against the wall of the hallway, staring at the closed door. She wanted to run, to leave the house and never look back, but she knew the storm outside still raged too violently to survive. She had no choice but to remain inside the cursed structure. But as she descended the stairs again, she heard it. The voices had returned. Only now they weren't whispers. They were laughter. Children laughing, high-pitched and echoing through the darkness, overlapping like a distorted choir. The sound danced from room to room, as though mocking her, daring her to follow. Emily gripped the candle tighter, whispering to herself, "It's not real. It's not real." But deep down, she already knew the truth. Something in this town was alive. Something had been waiting. And now, it had her name. The next morning was draped in a suffocating silence. A dense fog had rolled down from the mountains overnight, smothering the landscape until even the nearby woods seemed swallowed by an endless gray. It felt like the whole world had shrunk into the narrow space between the cabin walls, and beyond them, only the void. Thomas woke with a start, his body stiff from restless sleep, his mind replaying the screams that had echoed in his dreams. He rubbed his temples, trying to convince himself they were just remnants of fear, not something he had truly heard outside. The cabin's air was cold, every breath puffing out in a faint mist. He shuffled to the window and peered through the fog. His heart skipped. Just at the edge of visibility, a dark figure stood motionless among the trees. Its outline was faint, almost blending into the fog, but unmistakably human. Thomas blinked hard, pressed his forehead to the glass, but by the time his eyes focused, the figure was gone, as though it had dissolved into the mist itself. His chest tightened. He tried to reason with himself. The fog plays tricks, bending shapes, forming illusions. But deep down, he knew. Someone, or something, was watching. By midday, the fog refused to lift. The world outside looked like a watercolor painting left in the rain, blurred and incomplete. Inside, Thomas kept pacing. He thought of the whispering voice, the shadowed figure on the stairs, the bloody fingerprints that had mysteriously vanished. He thought of how his phone had died with a full charge. He thought of Emily, whose face returned to him in flashes of guilt and longing. Everything seemed to circle back to her, like the house itself was pushing him toward the memory of her death. That was when he noticed something new. The attic door, the one he had nailed shut his first night, was ajar. Not wide open, but just enough for a sliver of black to show through, like a mouth slightly parted, waiting. His stomach dropped. He knew he had hammered that door shut, knew it with certainty, and yet now it stood, crooked and inviting as if daring him. The silence deepened, becoming almost oppressive. He could hear only his own heartbeat in his ears. Step by cautious step, Thomas approached. The closer he got, the colder the air became, until his skin prickled with goosebumps. The gap in the door seemed to widen as he neared it, though he didn't remember touching it. He raised his trembling hand and nudged the door open just an inch further. A low creak groaned through the house, so loud it sounded alive. For a moment, nothing stirred. The darkness beyond the door was thick, velvety, impenetrable. Then, very faint, like it had traveled a great distance to reach him, came a whisper. "Thomas." His blood froze. It was Emily's voice. He staggered back, nearly tripping over his own feet. His breath came out ragged, uneven. He wanted to slam the door shut, to nail it back into place, to pretend nothing had happened. But that voice, the voice he hadn't heard in years, anchored him in place. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Help me." Tears burned in his eyes. His mind screamed that it was a trick, that the house was feeding him illusions. But his heart, desperate and aching, urged him forward. Against every instinct, he reached into the darkness, his hand trembling like a leaf in the wind. The air inside was icy, like plunging his hand into frozen water. Then something touched him. It was soft, cold, and unmistakably human. Fingers curled gently around his wrist. He gasped, jerking backward, but the grip held firm. His pulse thundered in his ears. He tried to wrench free, but the strength of the hand was impossible, inhuman. He dared to look up into the void, and for the first time, his eyes adjusted enough to see what waited in the attic. A face, pale, stretched, eyes wide with sorrow but wrong, too wide, too unblinking. It looked like Emily, but twisted, like a reflection in a broken mirror. Before he could scream, the attic door slammed shut with a violent crack, and the grip on his wrist vanished. He stumbled backward, clutching his arm, staring at the sealed door in horror. His heart pounded, his breath shallow, as silence reclaimed the house once again. But something was different now. He wasn't alone anymore. He could feel it in every corner of the cabin. He could sense eyes on him, watching, waiting. And in the deepest part of his soul, he realized with chilling certainty, whatever was in the attic had finally come down. Thomas pressed his back to the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the cold floor. His body trembled uncontrollably, his mind unraveling at the seams. He thought about running, about braving the fog and the forest, but a darker thought gnawed at him. What if the house didn't let him leave anymore? As the fog outside thickened further, Thomas could swear he saw shadows moving through it, figures circling the cabin, pacing, waiting for something. And then, as the final shiver ran down his spine, a knock echoed through the silence. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, but this time, they came from inside the cabin. The air inside the house was suffocating, thick with the scent of mildew and old wood that had been left to rot for decades. Ethan stood in the narrow hallway, his phone's flashlight slicing through the shadows like a trembling dagger of light. His breath was uneven, ragged, as though every inhale carried with it the weight of the house's unseen presence pressing down on his chest. The walls groaned faintly, the way old structures often did, but there was something different in this sound. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, as though the house itself was breathing with him, waiting for him to take his next step. At the far end of the hallway stood a crooked door, its paint chipped and peeling, revealing layers of faded colors from generations before. Ethan hesitated, staring at it, his mind screaming for him to turn back. But something deeper than fear urged him forward, an insatiable need to uncover what was hiding in this house, the reason his friends had vanished, the secret tied to that grotesque wall of photographs. He stepped closer, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight, each creak echoing far too loudly in the oppressive silence. When he finally touched the doorknob, it was ice cold, so cold it burned against his skin. For a moment, he thought he saw his breath plume in the air, though it was still the height of summer outside. He twisted the knob, and the door opened with a slow, high-pitched whine, the sound grating against his ears like nails dragging across metal. Beyond the door was a staircase leading down into complete blackness, a darkness so thick it seemed to pulse like a living thing. Something inside whispered, "Don't go down there." But another voice, stronger, commanded him forward. He descended, one step at a time, the wood beneath his feet fragile and threatening to collapse. With each step, the temperature dropped further, and the silence grew heavier, pressing against his eardrums until he thought he would go deaf. His flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, revealing only glimpses, crumbling stone walls, rusted pipes running along the ceiling, scraps of paper scattered across the floor like shed skin. At the bottom, the staircase ended in a long corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity. The walls were damp, slick with moisture, and along them were deep scratches, claw marks gouged into the stone, as though something had tried desperately to escape. Ethan's stomach twisted at the sight. His friends, had they been dragged down here? The thought sent a violent shiver through him. He followed the corridor, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust, until he came to a heavy steel door bolted shut. The bolts looked ancient, rusted to the point of fragility. And yet, they had been reinforced with chains, dozens of them, tightly wound across the door like someone had tried to ensure whatever was inside could never get out. His flashlight caught something smeared across the steel, dark stains that even after decades still held a sickly reddish-brown hue. His throat went dry. Blood. He leaned closer and noticed words etched crudely into the door, carved with desperation. "Do not open. It watches." A sick dread swelled inside him, but even then, curiosity gnawed at his sanity. He had to know what lay behind the door. With trembling hands, he reached for the chains, tugging at one. To his surprise, it snapped loose with barely any effort, as though the years had finally claimed its strength. One by one, the chains fell away, clattering to the floor, each sound reverberating through the corridor like a warning bell. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with anticipation, as though the house itself held its breath. When the last chain dropped, Ethan placed both hands on the door and shoved. It groaned, resisting him, until finally it swung inward. A blast of cold, rancid air rushed out, making him gag. His flashlight beam pierced the chamber beyond, revealing a vast underground room. The walls were covered in symbols, strange, jagged markings scrawled in black ink, repeated over and over in chaotic patterns. Some symbols glistened as if freshly drawn. The floor was littered with bones, animal and human alike, arranged in spirals, in circles, in crude altars of decay. At the center of the room stood an old wooden chair, and in that chair sat a figure. Ethan's breath hitched, his body going rigid. It was a man, or what had once been one. The figure was bound by ropes so tight they had cut into his flesh, leaving grotesque impressions. His head hung low, long strands of matted hair obscuring his face. At first, Ethan thought he was dead. But then, with a jerking, unnatural motion, the figure's head snapped upward. Two hollow sockets stared back at him, empty where eyes should have been. Ethan stumbled backward, his heart pounding like it might burst from his chest. The figure opened its mouth slowly, impossibly wide, a guttural noise escaping that was neither human nor animal. The sound reverberated through the chamber, a distorted shriek that made Ethan's vision blur. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in response, glowing faintly as though feeding off the noise. The figure strained against its bindings, the ropes tearing, fibers snapping one by one. Ethan turned to run, but the steel door slammed shut behind him with a thunderous crash, plunging the corridor into darkness. His flashlight flickered violently, then went out. He was trapped. And in the suffocating blackness, he heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, dragging across the stone floor, moving closer. The guttural sound transformed into a whisper now, low and rasping, threading into his ears. "I see you." The walls shuddered. The floor vibrated. Ethan pressed his back against the cold steel door, fumbling for a way out, but there was none. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until he could almost feel the breath of the eyeless figure against his skin. Then, in the pitch black, a hand touched his shoulder. The storm outside had turned the world into a furious battlefield of water and wind, battering the walls of the mansion as if the night itself wanted to tear it apart. Inside, the air grew colder, heavier, and almost suffocating, as though each breath Emily and Alex took pulled the mansion's history deeper into their lungs. The house no longer felt like a mere structure of wood and stone. It pulsed, almost like a living organism, with veins of darkness running through its foundations. Emily pressed her hand against the rotting banister, and for a split second, she swore she felt it twitch, as though the wood was not wood at all, but flesh stretched tight over something alive. "This house isn't haunted," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with revelation. "It is the haunting." Alex turned toward her, his pale face glistening with sweat, his eyes wide with the dawning terror of understanding. "What do you mean?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already feared the answer. Emily lifted the old diary she had clutched since they found it, its pages soaked with the stench of mildew and old blood. She had read fragments earlier, but now the words leapt off the paper with unbearable clarity. The diary wasn't written by a visitor. It wasn't written by a victim. It was written by the mansion itself, or by something inside it, speaking through human hands. The passages described hunger, not in the way a person grows hungry for food, but hunger for souls, for memory, for the essence of whoever crossed its threshold. Every disappearance, every unsolved mystery, every tragedy in Black Hollow wasn't random. It was fuel, a steady offering to the entity that lived within these walls. Alex's voice cracked. "You're saying the house eats them?" Emily nodded slowly, her throat too tight to speak. "It doesn't just eat them, it keeps them. That's why we heard voices. That's why we saw faces in the mirrors. They're not echoes, they're trapped. The house has them. Forever." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. As they sank in, a groan rolled through the mansion, low and guttural, as if the entire structure was laughing or moaning in delight. The chandelier above them trembled, casting fractured beams of light that danced across the walls like restless spirits trying to claw their way out. Then, without warning, the bulb inside it burst, showering shards of glass down like falling stars. The hallway behind them creaked loudly, then another step, then another, like someone, or something, was following. Alex spun around, holding the flashlight like a weapon, its weak beam slicing through the shadows. Nothing moved, and yet Emily swore she felt hot breath brush against her ear, accompanied by a whisper so faint it was almost inaudible. "Stay. Forever." She staggered forward, her chest tightening as panic set in. "We have to go," she urged, her voice breaking. "If we stay, we'll end up like the others. We'll never leave." But when Alex grabbed her hand and tried to retrace their path, they found themselves standing at a dead end, a wall that had not been there before. It wasn't stone or wood. It looked organic, like the inside of a rib cage, with pale, slick surfaces glistening in the dim light. Emily recoiled, gagging, realizing the house wasn't just metaphorically alive, it was physically transforming around them, trapping them deeper inside its bowels. Suddenly, the diary in Emily's hand grew hot, burning her skin. She yelped and dropped it, the book falling open to a page she hadn't seen before. The ink was fresh, glistening wet, though the handwriting was jagged and frantic. The words sprawled across the page. "You are part of me now. You are written in my blood. Run if you wish, but every path returns to me." Alex's breath came out in ragged gasps, his face white as bone. "It's writing to us. It knows we're here." Emily forced herself to pick the diary up, even though it felt like holding a beating heart. "No," she said, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince Alex or herself. "There has to be a way out. Every monster has a weakness." The walls trembled violently, and a crack split the ceiling, raining plaster down on their heads. From the crack seeped a black, tar-like substance that dripped in thick strands, writhing as if alive. One glob hit the floor near Emily's shoe, and she saw, horrified, that it contained a human eye blinking up at her, pleading silently before dissolving back into the sludge. Her stomach turned, but she couldn't look away. "It's feeding on them," she whispered. "All of them, piece by piece." Then, just as quickly, the storm outside silenced, as though someone had shut off the world's sound. The sudden quiet was worse than the thunder, worse than the screams, worse than the whispers. Emily could hear only the pounding of her heart and the slow, steady creak of the house breathing in and out. In that unnatural stillness, the floor beneath them began to split, and through the cracks came a low vibration, like a heartbeat. The house wasn't just alive. It had a core, a heart, something pulsing beneath its foundation. And Emily realized with dread certainty that if they didn't destroy it, they would become its next meal. She grabbed Alex's arm and pulled him close. "We're not running anymore. We're going to its heart." But as soon as she said it, the hallway behind them lit up with dozens of glowing eyes. Faces of the lost, twisted in agony, pressing through the walls as if trying to warn them. Their mouths opened in unison, releasing a deafening scream that rattled the floorboards and made the air taste of iron. Emily tightened her grip on Alex's hand. "We go deeper," she said, forcing herself to sound braver than she felt. "Because the only way out is through." And as they took their first step toward the mansion's heart, the walls closed in, almost lovingly, as though the house was guiding them, straight into its stomach. Have you ever woken up from a nightmare only to realize the nightmare wasn't over? It had simply followed you back into reality. That's where Emily now found herself, caught in the blurred boundary between dream and waking life, a place where shadows no longer obeyed the laws of nature and whispers became more real than flesh and blood. The church doors slammed shut with a force that rattled the rotten wooden frame. Dust cascaded from the rafters, and the candles that had lit themselves in the previous night's haunting flickered with a sickly green glow. Emily clutched the brass key in her pocket so tightly it bit into her skin, but the pain only grounded her, reminding her she was still alive, though every inch of her body screamed otherwise. Father O'Connor's eyes darted around the chapel, his breathing sharp and shallow. "It's not just a house anymore," he muttered, his voice trembling. "It's infected the whole town. Look." He pointed toward the altar. The old crucifix, once a symbol of solace and strength, was upside down, nailed into the wood as though some invisible hand had twisted it in mockery. Emily felt a rush of nausea. "This town," she whispered. "It's not dying, is it? It's already dead." A low hum began, vibrating through the church floorboards. It wasn't just sound, it was vibration, a pulse, as though the ground itself had a heartbeat. The hum grew into a chorus of layered voices, none entirely human. Emily pressed her hands against her ears, but it was inside her head, slithering through her thoughts. "You came back. You unlocked us. Now you belong here." She stumbled backward, bumping into one of the pews, and nearly fell. The air had grown thick, heavy, as though the chapel itself was suffocating her. Then the windows darkened, not with the night, but with something that pressed against the glass from outside. Dozens of silhouettes, tall, misshapen, writhing. They had no features Emily could make out, yet she felt their attention, their hunger, their malice. Father O'Connor staggered toward the altar, fumbling with his rosary. "It's them, the ones who never left, the ones bound to this soil." His voice cracked. "They're waiting for the final offering." Emily's blood turned cold. She thought back to the diary she had read, the one left behind by the Hollowfield family. The pages had hinted at a ritual, a deal struck to contain the horrors, but never destroyed. "An offering?" she repeated, dread lacing every word. What kind of offering? The priest's silence told her everything. He didn't want to say it. He didn't need to. Emily already knew, deep down. Her body trembled, but before she could press him for answers, the ground split open with a deafening crack. A jagged fissure tore across the church floor, swallowing chunks of wood and sending pews toppling. From the darkness below rose a hand, not bone, not flesh, something in between, charred, twisted, clawed. It clawed its way upward, dragging itself toward the surface. Emily's scream caught in her throat as more hands emerged. First 2, then 5, then dozens, all writhing, all clawing their way out of the abyss. The hum intensified into a full shriek that rattled the stained glass until one by one they shattered, raining down shards that glittered in the sickly candlelight. Father O'Connor fell to his knees, his voice a broken whisper. "They were never banished, only buried alive beneath this place. And now..." His eyes met Emily's, wild and desperate. "You brought the key." Her heart stopped. The brass key in her pocket burned against her thigh. She realized what it meant. The key hadn't unlocked answers. It had unlocked them. The first creature pulled itself free from the crack, its form grotesque and shifting, as though flesh couldn't decide what shape it wanted to take. A face materialized briefly, eyes hollow, mouth stretched impossibly wide in a scream that had no sound, then melted away into something unrecognizable. Its shadow stretched across the floor and climbed the walls, twisting into impossible angles. Emily and Father O'Connor backed away, but the church doors behind them refused to open. They rattled, then sealed with a slam so final it made Emily feel as though the outside world had ceased to exist. She pressed her back to the wall, her chest heaving. "We can't fight them," she whispered. "They're not even... alive." The priest shook his head, his expression grim. "No, but they need to be fed." The implication hit Emily like a punch. She wasn't sure if he meant her, him, or both of them. But before she could speak, the creatures surged forward, their claws scraping across the floor, dragging themselves closer. The chapel was now a tomb, the candles flickering out one by one until only the green glow remained, illuminating the horrors crawling toward them. Emily's mind raced. There had to be something, some way to fight back, to seal them again, to undo the mistake she had made by using that cursed key. And then it struck her. The diary had mentioned blood. Not just sacrifice, but blood of the one who carried the burden. Her hands shook as she pulled the key from her pocket. It pulsed faintly, almost alive. She gripped it tight and looked at the priest. If they want blood, maybe it doesn't have to be both of us. Maybe just mine. Father O'Connor's face contorted in panic. No, Emily. That's what they want. They'll trick you, they'll take you, and then they'll take everyone else. But Emily barely heard him. The creatures were too close now, their shadows stretching out like skeletal fingers grasping for her. The ground shook harder, the air splitting with unholy screams. She raised the key high, feeling it burn hotter and hotter in her palm. The shadows recoiled slightly, as though the object itself carried some strange power. For a brief second, hope flickered in her chest. But then she noticed something she hadn't before. The key's surface was no longer brass. It was turning black, pulsing like a vein under skin. And for just a moment she swore she saw her reflection in it, except the eyes staring back weren't hers. They were hollow, hungry. The realization hit her too late. The key wasn't a weapon, it was a lure. And she had already taken the bait. The shadows surged all at once, swallowing the last of the green light, plunging the church into pitch-black darkness. Emily screamed as something icy wrapped around her wrist, pulling her toward the crack in the floor. The last thing she heard before being dragged into the abyss was the priest's voice, echoing above the chaos, half prayer, half curse. Then silence. Emily is dragged into the abyss by the shadows, realizing the key was never meant to save, it was meant to feed.